Hi all. For today's memorization technique, I thought we would work on one for anemia, and it is using a thing called Coggle.it. It's a Google product. I am not a very artistic person, and I still like things to look nice, and this allows me to make things that look nice. This is a mind map. A mind map is another way of engaging with material that you have to engage more fully because you are distilling the information that you get into its most basic points. And that helps us to learn things better. Here we have the central theme of anemia. And there's several ways of breaking down anemia as a concept, but one of the first ones would be regenerative versus non-regenerative. We'll work on non-regenerative anemias first. When we think of non-regenerative anemias, we think of anemia of inflammatory disease, which used to be called anemia of chronic disease. And we also think of anemia associated with kidney failure or chronic kidney disease. And these ones also tend to be mild. When we think back to Dr. Woods, what he taught us, we think about this being a mild normocytic, normochromic, non-regenerative anemia. The other types of anemias that fall under this non-regenerative category are portosystemic shunt, PSS. And then we could also cross-train by adding some information about portosystemic shunt, like whether it's intrahepatic or extrahepatic, whether there are multiple connecting vessels or whether there's a single vessel, and so on and so forth. You could add that information later, but let's just stick to anemia for the moment. And this one is microcytic, but still normochromic. And again, as I said in lecture before, they don't know why it's microcytic but normochromic, but I think it's probably because they're just not getting the groceries in to make sufficient hemoglobin to have a normal sized red blood cell, because it's the concentration of hemoglobin that determines how large a red cell is. Hemoglobin concentration is tightly regulated, and every red cell is supposed to have a specific concentration of hemoglobin. So if I have not enough hemoglobin, the red cells undergo an extra division and therefore become smaller. So they're microcytic, and that smaller red blood cell has sufficient hemoglobin so that they are normochromic. Blood loss. And this would be iron deficiency anemia. In the early stages of iron deficiency anemia, it will be regenerative, but oftentimes by the time we see it, and certainly how we like students to remember it, is that iron deficiency anemia is non-regenerative. And this one is microcytic and hypochromic. Again, because it doesn't have enough hemoglobin, the red cell has undergone an extra division. The trick is they can only undergo one extra division. So by the time they become microcytic, and then eventually they run out of iron, so they eventually become hypochromic. Moving over to the regenerative side, these tend to be marked anemias because they involve things like blood destruction and things that can cause blood destruction are IMHA, and that can be intravascular or extravascular. And you'll recall that you could also be adding things about IMHA that might be present, such as the shape of the red blood cells. We look for ghost erythrocytes, we look for spherocytes, particularly in dogs, where that can be appreciated very readily, less so in other species. And then we can also add information such as cholestasis or hyperbilirubinemia from prehepatic cholestasis, when there's just too much unconjugated bilirubin needing to be conjugated, and the liver can't keep up. But you could also add that information, add the IMHA information into your memory palace or method of loci, where we had talked about cholestasis or hyperbilirubinemia. Another reason for this would be onions and garlic. Animals eating that tend to have hemolytic anemia. Kale is another one. This is more for people who might be going to New Zealand where they feed kale crops. Copper toxicosis, where sheep don't have enough molybdenum to balance out the copper, and then they get stressed and their liver releases all the copper that it's been storing up, and then you get a hemolytic anemia associated with that. Another one would be Ikeda, for anybody going to New Zealand. That's in cattle, and hemoparasite associated with that. And then certainly here we think of Jiminy crickets. We think of Babesia, and there's various types of Babesia which you could add to your own diagram, or other hemoparasites, such as various mycoplasmas, which may or may not be associated with anemia, depending on the burden of parasitemia and how healthy the individual is. That's blood destruction. And then we have acute blood loss. And we can think about cases where we have internal bleeding. And that might be from something like a ruptured hemangiosarc, where they bleed into the abdomen, a bleeding tumor of another type, and anticoagulant rat bait. So they will have hemarthrosis, and they might have hemorrhage into the thorax or the abdominal cavity. Now we have external blood loss. And we can think of things like hit by car is quite obvious. We might have a gastric ulcer. Pigs like to have that if they're fed too high a concentrate. Don't quote me on that. Look at your health management notes. And we might have an abomasal ulcer in cattle. Then we could have surgical blood losses. Oops. And anticoagulant rat bait appears in two of these because, of course, we could have GI hemorrhage, and then that's lost from the body. And the final category I have here, we could add more, certainly, would be severe thrombocytopenia. The thing about internal blood loss is that these also tend to be markedly regenerative, because the building blocks are still in the body. So if I have a ruptured hemangiosarc, that blood actually autotransfuses. About 80% will autotransfuse within the first 2 to 3 days. And that occurs via small holes that are in the peritoneal cavity and thoracic cavity. They're called stoma. It goes back into the body. Macrophages clear up the rest of those erythrocytes that are lost. The iron, the heme, the proteins are all inside the macrophage, and it can travel to the bone marrow and let the body utilize those materials, recycle those materials. These internal types of blood loss tend to be very regenerative. External blood loss is also very regenerative because it occurs acutely, and there's an acute hypoxemic event that happens, and the individual tends to have a markedly regenerative anemia. The thing about these ones is these are macrocytic, and of course, channeling Dr. Wood, hypochromic. And they're macrocytic because baby erythrocytes, reticulocytes, are larger than mature red cells, and they can mature in the bone marrow. And they're hypochromic because they haven't yet finished producing all of their hemoglobin. We could also talk about what's going on in the individual. On the mild anemia side, These individuals clinically appear pale, depending on how marked the anemia is. It's generally mild. In marked anemia, these ones with blood destruction tend to be yellow. These ones with this internal bleeding tend to be yellow. And these ones over here, it depends what's going on with that. They may be pale, or they may have some degree of icterus. But with severe thrombocytopenia, that's when you're going to start seeing petechiation. We can add another layer on here of how the individual looks clinically. We can also talk about how well they're dealing with the anemia. Individuals on the mild side, they've had a long time to become accustomed to it. They may not know that they're anemic. The kitten with fleas that has a PCV of 6 might not recognize that it is that anemic. So it might look just slightly listless. However, the individuals over here, these anemias happen more rapidly most of the time, and so they can be quite flat. Coping, not coping would be another way of dividing these things up. That's it for anemia and the mind map as well. So you would have to generate all of these branches yourself and organize them. I just generated them all and then depopulated the boxes so that it would make it quicker for us here today. All right, happy studying, everybody.